As you might know, the MOVE initiative is a knowledge exchange platform designed to facilitate the transition towards electric mobility in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. As part of MOVE's series of conversations, today we're privileged to host an expert who is actively shaping the electric mobility landscape in the Caribbean. So I'm thrilled to introduce Mr. Codis Boudou, who is a pioneer and leader in the Caribbean electric mobility. Since 2004, Codis has been serving as an assistant professor in the Utilities Engineering Unit at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, and he manages their Electrical and Electronics Engineering Diploma program. This year, his work has been key for the successful implementation of the first electric bus project in Trinidad and Tobago. Codis also chairs the electric vehicle work group of the CARICOM since 2017 and oversees the first of its kind renewable energy technician program. His expertise extends to consulting roles for significant organizations like the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the Barbados government, and the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, along with international institutions such as UNDP, UNEP, IDP, and GIZ. We're very excited to have you, Codis, here to present us today. And after his presentation, I will allow an interactive Q&A session where you can share your questions and insights. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Mr. Boudou and invite you all to embark in this very exciting conversation with him.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you very much for your very kind and generous words. It is most definitely a pleasure to be here this morning and to really extend a conversation as it relates to e-mobility in the Caribbean. I was fortunate enough to deliver a previous session for the MOVE initiative on e-mobility for the Caribbean, and today's session is really an extension of that, where I give a status update as it relates to e-mobility in the region. My status update is from projects I would have worked on. So quite a lot of it would be my own experience. Some of it, of course, will be factual. Some will be my opinions as well, which I would gladly be distinguishing both of them. So let me just make sure that I am on full screen. Right, so this is what, this is a Sankey diagram for the Caribbean region. The audience today or this morning is well known as it relates to energy and e-mobility. But what a Sankey diagram illustrates is really the flows from your input of energy to the end use. This Sankey diagram is not for the entire CARICOM region, so I should say that it includes most of the countries, but not all. If you focus on the Sankey diagram, you could see the major inputs of energy, which is really from natural gas and oil. So you may be thinking, well, in the Caribbean, we don't have as much natural gas, but Trinidad and Tobago is included in this analysis. So that sort of skews the data, especially as it relates to natural gas. It is important to note that all Caribbean countries, all members of CARICOM, import their liquid transportation fuel, and this is inclusive of Trinidad and Tobago. Our refinery in Trinidad and Tobago would have been mothballed in 2018, so all members of CARICOM import their liquid transportation fuel. So if you quickly look on the right-hand side of the Sankey diagram to the different sectors, you can see that transport is significant. So transport is accounting for around 20% of the end use of energy for the selected countries we have here in CARICOM. So it's quite significant. On a country level or individual country level, the end use of energy for transportation can be as much as 40%, between 40 and 50 for individual CARICOM member states. This is the case for Jamaica, and this is the case for Belize. So those are the countries that come to mind. It's also the case for quite a number of the smaller islands as well, where a significant end use of energy is towards transportation. So we import our transportation fuel, liquid fuels, and it accounts for a significant amount of our end use. And of course, this data is 2021 data. So this narrative is what I would have shared in my previous presentation in the MOVE initiative. And it really, very little has changed since then as it relates to the end use of energy. So around 20% of energy, end use of energy for the region is for transportation. This accounts for a lot of emissions. And so this graphic really does show you the breakdown for emissions for the different sectors within the region. It should be noted that quite a number of the NDCs for individual member states do address the transportation issue as it relates to emissions. So it is something that member states within CARICOM are most definitely aware of. So if you break down the emissions as it relates to the transportation sector, quite a lot of it is based from diesel and gasoline. That would not be a surprise because those are the two main liquid fuels that are in use in the transportation sector. So transportation end use of energy is significant in the region when you look at it as an entire region and individually for different member states. So how did the pandemic affect the region? And specifically, we have some examples for individual member states of CARICOM. So what this graphic is showing, it is showing the percentage difference between real GDP pre-pandemic, which is 2019, and real GDP as of 2021. So this graphic hopes, or it is the intention at least, to illustrate what effect has the pandemic had on economies of the member states of CARICOM. So immediately you could see that it has very little effect on Guyana. Guyana, of course, really accelerating and leading the region as it relates to oil and gas finds or oil finds. So the economy, the Guyanese economy is most definitely booming, and they are leading the region. So if we move past the excellent performance of Guyana and make our way down towards the bottom of the graphic, you would see that quite a number of CARICOM countries here, Suriname, St. Lucia, Barbados, Bahamas, these are all CARICOM countries, and they are at the bottom of the list. So within the region, we have been affected severely by the pandemic. In the case of Suriname, it's very close to 20% decrease in real GDP from 2019. We have seen figures greater than 10 for, very close. We have seen figures greater than 10 for other CARICOM countries. So why has the Caribbean been affected as much or this severely because of the pandemic? Well, quite a number of these member states do have a significant tourism sector. And of course, during the pandemic and slightly after the pandemic, the tourism sector was badly hit by the travel restrictions and the lockdowns. So this is seen in this graphic. So just to remind you of the context, of course, we import all our liquid transportation fuel. It's a significant component of our transportation sector, and we did not do well in the pandemic. There was a lot of effect on the individual economies. Specific to the Caribbean region, we have very specific, what I like to call bridges and hurdles as it relates to e-mobility. And in the context of the pandemic, these challenges or bridges and hurdles, they would have been amplified because it's in the context of very low economic growth or decreased economic growth. And this would have an effect on adoption of electric mobility in the region. So some of the hurdles you would see on the left, and these hurdles, as I mentioned, some of them are specific to the Caribbean region, some of them are general hurdles for the entire LAC region. But we would have discovered these hurdles through public consultation in the region as we move towards developing a regional electric vehicle strategy. So a number of these hurdles would have been amplified in the context of low economic growth by individual member states and the region as a whole. There are also bridges or opportunities, and I will talk about how electric vehicles could really, in the context of this low economic growth, could enhance these opportunities that the region does have. So if I were to extract the major challenges coming out of COVID-19 and also the major challenges in general as it relates to electric vehicles, the biggest one or the one on the forefront is really the higher upfront costs. If you look at the transportation sector in the Caribbean, and let us focus on passenger cars or passenger vehicles. The market is one where we have quite a lot of used vehicles or imported used vehicles that come into the region. And that is because used vehicles are much cheaper than a new one. So the used vehicle market in the Caribbean is a large market where we import mainly from Japan directly and the UK, because most of the member states drive on the same side of the road. So that upfront costs as it relates to electric vehicles is still there. It's just more expensive. Electric vehicle in the market in the Caribbean as it stands is still more expensive than a traditional or relevant ICE vehicle. As we deploy more electric vehicles, we would have to upgrade our electrical infrastructure. I have not seen circumstances where this is currently an issue. It is, of course, an issue in the medium term, but as it stands, it is not an issue as it relates, at least in the short term, the upgrade of the electrical infrastructure, because our deployment of electric vehicles within the region still remains low. There's an equity issue as it relates to electric vehicles, as I mentioned, and I'll talk more about this as we go through some other points. And that equity issue is that if you have an asset that is more costly, then you exclude certain portions of society from owning that asset. So there's most definitely that equity issue within the region. And, as you saw in the Sankey diagram, we import all our liquid transportation fuel, and it accounts for 20% in the region, and certain member states, it could be up to 40%. So there's quite a lot of economic activity associated with liquid transportation fuels and ICE vehicles or internal combustion engine vehicles. So as you transition to e-mobility, you have to take this into consideration. There will be job losses, there will be loss in economic activity. You have to address these issues very early on as you transition. So the approach that I want to suggest, and I noticed that this is the approach that we are seeing of quite a number of the member states or the governments, is one where there's a focus on fleets and public transportation, and to a lesser extent, one that focuses on using electric vehicles for economic recovery, especially as it relates to the SMEs or the small, micro enterprises within the region. So within the Caribbean region, we have quite a number of SMEs that are active. And these SMEs, of course, are involved in the tourism sector and the agriculture sector. And they would have a high costs related to transportation of goods or services. So there's an opportunity for the use of electric vehicles within these SMEs, so by these SMEs, to really drive economic growth, provided they could overcome this initial high cost barrier, high upfront costs. So what are the different member states doing as it relates to incentives for the adoption of electric vehicles? So there is a widespread or a wide range of incentives that you could find throughout the region. And I just have a few here that I'll chat quickly about. The most comprehensive package of incentives I have seen in CARICOM is, of course, for Montserrat. Montserrat is overseas territory of the UK. I believe the population of Montserrat is perhaps less than 5,000. So it's a small population. It's one of the overseas territories. And they have one of the most comprehensive package as it relates to incentives for EVs. They are tax exempted. They also cover the batteries or replacement batteries from tax exemptions. And they also offer the tax exemptions for charging stations. So the package that Montserrat offers is one that can be looked at by other member states. But you see, there's a challenge. So I mentioned the difficulties of member states coming out of the pandemic. And to offer tax incentives from the lens of the government, these tax incentives deny the state of revenue. And taxes for vehicles within the Caribbean region is a very lucrative means, a stream of revenue for government. So not all member states can, or they believe they can afford offering full tax exemptions for electric vehicles and the charging stations and the replacement batteries as comprehensive as Montserrat. So moving from Montserrat, I would like to jump over to Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago does not offer a comprehensive tax incentive package compared to Montserrat, but the duties and taxes on the electric vehicles themselves have been removed. That has not been extended to the charging stations or the batteries. But there is a restriction in that this tax exemption is only allowed on vehicles up to 2 years old. So you are allowed to bring in a new electric vehicle and you could benefit from that tax exemption in Trinidad, or you could bring one that's at most 2 years old. Now, this policy has been implemented from, I believe, 2021. So it has been here for some time. And I would say that it has not reaped the benefits that has been expected of it, meaning that the deployment of electric vehicles in Trinidad and Tobago still remains relatively low. And there's a reason for that. Remember, I mentioned the equity issue. So by you removing the taxes on new electric vehicles and electric vehicles that are relatively new, then you sort of exclude the low-income portion of society from benefiting from this tax exemption, because the low-income portion of society cannot afford a new vehicle or even one that is relatively new in the first place. So they're not benefiting from the tax incentives. It's those who can afford it are the ones benefiting. So let's move over from Trinidad and Tobago and head to Guyana. Guyana had one of the most interesting incentives for electric vehicles within CARICOM, but they recently changed it. But I'll tell you the first version. An electric vehicle in Guyana a few years ago would be exempted from all taxes if it was 5 years and older. So the Guyanese began to offer exemption or total exemptions from the older electric vehicles, 5 years and older. And this approach directly address the equity issue, meaning that the lower income portion of society, of course, can't afford a new vehicle, but a vehicle that's probably 5 years old, they can afford that. And that is the vehicle that you remove all the taxes off. Of course, the Guyanese recently updated their incentives, and they now offer tax exemptions from EVs regardless of the age. So new EVs, new electric vehicles in addition to the older ones. So they extended that incentive bracket. So moving on to Jamaica, Jamaica is an example of a CARICOM country that is committed to electric vehicles, but is cognizant of the economic state of not only the country, but the region. So they removed or they decreased the duties on EVs from 30% to 10%. They still kept some duties because taxes from vehicles is a lucrative revenue stream for governments. So you know, it's really a fine balancing act that you would see as you go through different member states. And lastly, I would like to just quickly talk about the leader as it relates to e-mobility in the Caribbean, Barbados. Barbados has continued to lead the region, and their incentives are incentives that could serve as a case study for other member states. So they have extended the VAT holiday as it relates to electric vehicles. But what they're doing, and this is unique to them, me personally, I have not seen this on other member states. They are now offering low interest revolving loans for the purchase of electric vehicles. Now, this low interest revolving loan is for private vehicle operators. So persons involved in public transport, take for example, taxis and others, can access these loans. And this is an excellent initiative that the region can learn from. To implement e-mobility, you have to, especially in the Caribbean region, you have to have a holistic approach that touches on many aspects. And for the next few slides, for each one of these criteria or aspects that I have, I'll just briefly talk about what I have seen in the region. So the first one that I would like to talk about is a major barrier, as I mentioned, and it is financing. And we just very briefly spoke about Barbados providing some special financing for private bus operators. This is the only Caribbean country, as I would have seen, that offers this ability or this instrument. I'm not saying it's comprehensive. This is at least what I know of. We have seen a number of PPPs in the region, public and private partnerships related to e-mobility, as it relates to charging infrastructure, as it relates to the purchase of vehicles as well. So that's a mechanism that I'm being used very slowly in the region. But there is also a need to work on financing for EVs to address the biggest barrier we have, which is really that upfront costs. Leadership and coordination is critical. So what I have seen in the Caribbean, and I'll talk about the public sector first. Electric vehicles, because electric vehicles represent the interface between transport and energy. You have your two very, very large government ministries involved. So you would have your Ministry of Energy involved, and you have your Ministry of Transport. And in certain Caribbean islands or member states, there is a ministry devoted to sustainable development, and they are also involved. So the public stakeholders, as it relates to electric vehicles or e-mobility, it's sort of a large mix of public stakeholders. Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Transport, if there's a Ministry of Sustainable Development. And within the public sector, it's best for one of these ministries to take the lead. From my experience, I have seen mainly the Ministry of Energy being the entity that takes the lead as it relates to e-mobility. And from my experience, they are a good choice. They are a good choice to take the lead. What's the reason for that? So if you look at different member states, you would realize that we have comprehensive energy policies or sustainable energy policies. And the energy technocrats in the region are very much involved in the preparation of these policies. They're involved in conferences. They are well traveled. So that capacity within the Ministry of Energies and the different Ministry of Energies in the region, as it relates to technical capacity and otherwise, it's very high. I'm not saying the persons involved in the transportation sector don't have that capacity. But if you look at the member states, you would realize that whereas we have very comprehensive energy policies, our transportation policies are either absent or lacking. So when you don't have these comprehensive policies, the technocrats may not be as well experienced as the equivalent technocrats from the Ministry of Energies. So from my experience, I have seen the leadership position taken from mainly the Ministry of Energy. There have been many attempts to form coordination bodies as it relates to e-mobility, and these attempts have been driven by the donors that are active in the region. A nice example is the EV Council from Jamaica. There are equivalent bodies within different countries. My comment on this is that the involvement of private sector in this coordination committees or steering committees or oversight committees needs to be improved. There is some level of private sector involvement, but most definitely there's room for improvement there. So I'm pleased to say that there has been quite a lot of work as it relates to upskilling of electric vehicles or training on the repair, maintenance, and operation of electric vehicles. Again, Barbados is leading the way. So within the individual member states, there are national universities or colleges that focus on TVET, technical vocational educational training. And a number of these TVET organizations from different member states are offering programs or training programs related to electric vehicles. So Barbados being one, this is an example from Jamaica as well. I know that is happening in St. Lucia. It's happening in Trinidad as well. So there is this training or the commitment to offer local training to increase the local capacity as it relates to electric vehicles in the region, which is good for us. Of course, long-term planning is something that I see being focused on in the region, and the long-term planning is really driven by the NDCs. So member states are aware that a significant amount of emissions comes from the transportation sector, and you will see that reflected on the individual NDCs for the different member states. So they are aware of it, and as member states begin to revise their NDCs, I'm seeing more studies focused on the transportation sector. So there is this long-term planning that's ongoing in the transportation sector, which is excellent for the region. Now, a lot of the work that and projects I would have been involved in is really focused around electric buses or e-mobility as it relates to public transportation. And I'm pleased to say that the status of electric bus projects that I would have seen in the region is great, or it's exciting, at least on my end. The first electric bus within CARICOM came into the region in 2017. So we're in 2023, so it's about 5 years time, and in 5 years time we have quite a number of projects, and the list of projects that you're seeing are ongoing or committed projects as it relates to electric buses. So let me focus on the larger ones, and the larger electric bus projects come from the two largest economies within CARICOM, which is Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. So Trinidad currently, there's in fact a live tender for 240 electric buses. And the government of Jamaica has committed towards the purchase of 200 electric buses. So the two largest economies in the region are showing their commitment towards e-mobility, and especially in the critical area of public transportation. And as I briefly mentioned, public transportation addresses the equity issue as it relates to e-mobility, in that you are able to incorporate the lower income portion of society, and they could benefit from the many benefits as it relates to commuting or using electric vehicles. Having said that, the larger economies of Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, they both have institutions that are devoted towards public transport, state-owned and state-run public transport institutions. So these governments can make these large fleet commitments because they have an entity that is responsible for public transportation. So, this is one of the reasons why you see these large numbers. Of course, Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica have a relatively larger islands, and they have relatively larger populations. As it relates to electric buses, we are seeing quite a number of pilots that are ongoing. You would see pilot in Belize. There's a conversion electric bus project in St. Lucia. There was a pilot in Antigua and Barbuda. They're purchasing 2 more buses. And of course, Barbados leads the way with the largest fleet as it currently stands, or deployed fleet for electric buses, and that fleet is growing. So the status of public transportation as it relates to electric buses for the region is a healthy one. And we are seeing quite a number of commitments from at least the larger economies within the region leading the way. Now, the Caribbean region is unique. So the buses I just spoke about are larger buses, 12 meter to 8 or 9 meter buses, right? So those are the buses in the graphic before I was talking about. But quite a number of the islands within the region, we don't have the roads that can handle these larger buses, 12-meter buses, for example. And quite a number of the public transportation is provided by what are called minibuses. We call them maxi taxis in Trinidad. They're called ZR in Barbados. But this form factor of a bus or a minibus is very popular throughout the region. Of course, the ICE variant is the one that's popular. So public transportation in the Caribbean region is run by the state, which would have these larger buses. And then in parallel, you have private organizations that run public transportation, private owners, and they would use buses or minibuses of these form factor. So one of these vehicles or minibuses landed in the region could cost around 50,000 US to 60,000 US new. And I have not seen them deployed in numbers. They are available, but the price again, or the cost for these vehicles is the great barrier. Because this minibus form factor is relatively new globally, you're not getting as much used vehicles that meet this size out of Japan or out of the UK, where we import our used vehicles from. So if they don't have much used vehicles, we would not get them necessarily in the Caribbean, because a used vehicle is much cheaper than this new vehicle. So this form factor, or this 12-seater vehicle, is very important for the region, and to have the electric version that is affordable. and affordable to private owners that operate these types of vehicles for public transportation is really something that the region needs to focus on, because you need to get private sector and these small businesses that are involved in transportation and public transportation get them access to e-mobility or electric vehicles. On the projects I have worked on, I have seen the dominance as it relates to the Chinese brands within the region. BYD has quite a number of buses deployed. There's interest as well from Haiger, Yutong, and Ankai. Ankai has a bus deployed in Jamaica. There are other brands as well deployed in Barbados from the private operators are using, but they are Chinese. And I have here just a small note that at least where I stand and from my experience, there has not been much interest from the European or American brands. I could expect, or I understand the reason for the American brands, because we in the Caribbean don't drive on the same side of the road as in the US, or at least most member states do. So there's that challenge. But we import quite a lot of our used passenger vehicles, ICE passenger vehicles from the UK and Japan. And I have not seen the interest from these manufacturers in the Caribbean. I guess the interest by the Chinese is easy to explain. They are involved in projects within the region, quite a lot of projects, not only relating to public transportation, but other aspects. So it's easier for the Chinese to enter the market as it relates to public transportation in the region. From my experience, I've seen a very small uptake of electric taxis, mainly because the passenger vehicles, they really do cost more compared to your ICE vehicle, of course. But taxis, you get more benefit in public transportation, the more individuals or persons you could carry. So larger buses or even this minibus, it's more cost effective for you compared to a taxi, which may have less persons or even one person using that service. So what I have seen is very small uptake of taxis in the region, electric taxis. So it is important to always tie back electric vehicles, which is really a subset of sustainable transportation. And the region should focus, and government and member states should focus on sustainable transportation, although a lot of focus is shifted on electric vehicles. Most of the capital cities within the region suffer from traffic. What levels of traffic depends on is relative, right? And a lot of this traffic is because of natural congestion. The roads are narrow. There isn't parking space within the capital cities, and a lot of these issues could be solved if we encourage the use of non-motorized forms of transportation, and we invest in the infrastructure to support non-motorized forms of transportation. Investing in sidewalks, covered sidewalks for walking, probably the use of bicycles, etc. So a lot of resources and a lot of focus is on e-mobility, but we should not lose sight that e-mobility is one of the components of sustainable transportation, and the final goal for us should be sustainable transportation. And I have seen energy policies within the region evolve, whereby we would have member states producing an energy policy or a sustainable energy policy. And there's now a substantial element of that policy devoted towards transportation. Quite a number of member states also have policies related to tourism and agriculture. So it's about trying to integrate transportation and energy in quite a number of these key areas. So your policy be it energy policy, transportation policy, or your tourism policy, should reflect these key or critical areas. So it should be integrated. So if you have your tourism master plan, then you should look at energy use, energy efficiency, and you should also incorporate transportation, sustainable transportation, and e-mobility. Take, for example, if you look at your tourism master plan. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that when we are planning policies, it should be an integrated policy that look at the main revenue generators for the region: tourism, agriculture, and of course, energy and transportation, all in the context of sustainable development. So I believe this was my last slide. Yes, it is. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Curtis, for your detailed presentation, and it was very interesting to learn more about not only the current situation in the Caribbean, but the likely pathways to decarbonize the transport sector, adopting more electric vehicles. It was really, really interesting. And I've received a bunch of very interesting questions as well for you. And let me start with one that is related to what you were commenting about the small and medium-sized enterprises. So the question is, how do innovative business models in the SMEs are contributing to the transition to electric mobility in the Caribbean? Do you have any information about ongoing initiatives?
So I would say that there is a lot of scope for work as it relates to incorporating electric vehicles or getting SMEs to invest and use electric vehicles within the region. The business models that I would have encountered are mainly for larger or entities that have access to financing or larger amounts of financing that can invest on EVs. And there's a lot of scope for improving access of electric vehicles to SMEs as it relates to overcoming this the higher financing costs. And I don't have any positive examples that I could give of this being done, unfortunately. So.
Yes, I guess it's an ongoing process that probably is hosting interesting conversations or agreements to see how to make it happen, basically, right?
No, well, to add to that, the government of Barbados is doing a good job at it with the revolving loan system that they are offering for SMEs involved in private public transportation. So they have this revolving loan facility. You could purchase an electric bus, or you could purchase an electric minibus, and at least that is available. So that cheap or relatively cheap financing is available to SMEs in Barbados involved in public transportation. So I guess that's an example.
And it relates to another question I received, and is about financing mechanisms. It says, what financing options and mechanisms are being explored to support the electrification of transportation in the Caribbean, besides the one
So I'll give you the honest answer from my experience. You would have seen the two larger economies, Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, providing the financing, meaning the state. So the state is the driver for this financing. And this financing would come through the form of loans or state loans. A lot of the pilot projects in the region started off with donor-assisted funding. So you would find there are quite a number of donors active in the region. European Union is one of them. They have funded quite a number of e-mobility projects. And their funding was essential for pilot programs. And of course, the pilots move on from there. Financing remains the biggest barrier for e-mobility in the region. So if it's not driven by state actors, as in the case of Trinidad and Jamaica, it has been difficult for financing for e-mobility projects otherwise. That is my comment on that.
Good. Thank you so much for that information and insights. Is of course a key component on the materializing investments to find those suitable financing mechanisms. I have another question, which is from the audience, and is how can Trinidad and Tobago justify the adoption of electric mobility?
Yeah, I saw that question. That's an interesting question.
To their low cost of fuel.
So please don't believe that fuel is cheap in Trinidad and Tobago. I guess you could use the word relatively, but if you ask any Trinidadian, they will say it's not cheap. But I think the investment in Trinidad was made because of our commitment, our NDC commitment. So all the way in 2018, we committed to reducing our emissions in the public transportation sector to 30% or by 30%. So it's a sizable amount. In fact, it's one of the most aggressive emission reduction commitment in transportation in CARICOM. So we have one of the most aggressive NDCs as it relates to public transport. And I guess it's the government following through on that commitment. The second reason is the state-owned and state-operated transportation organization in Trinidad would like to benefit from cost savings as it relates to maintenance and fuel costs. So those are the main drivers. But I think it's mainly driven from that policy decision made a while ago to commit to reducing emissions in transportation, and the state actor or the state institution wanting to reduce their overall maintenance and operation costs.
Good. And in terms of taxes, you also touched upon the incentives and all that. So, to the level of fossil fuel consumption, do you see any pushback from governments to maintain the revenue levels from fossil fuel commercialization?
I wouldn't say at the government level, but of course there are private sector and other stakeholders who would give this pushback, right? As it relates especially to private owners involved in the public transportation sector. They see e-mobility. I mean, a passenger electric car is very expensive, and they would see e-mobility being a threat to them because they can't necessarily afford an electric car, or they don't have any intentions of changing over their current vehicle, ICE vehicle that they currently own. So I would say from my experience, I've seen the pushback as it relates to the private sector or persons involved in the liquid fuel business. There have been concerns about among gas station owners or persons that work around liquid fuels. So that those are stakeholders that have voiced their concern as it relates to e-mobility. So those are the stakeholders I have experience with that do give you some sort of pushback as it relates to EVs within the region.
Good. Next question is from Carly Remy. Do you see that hybrid developments can make energy, hydraulic, wind, and especially solar more profitable combined with e-mobility?
So one of the advantages the Caribbean region has is the abundance of renewable energy resource, solar, wind. I think that the best synergy for renewable energy and electric vehicles is to continue our commitments to clean up the electricity grid, meaning that within the member state NDCs, there would be commitments for renewable energy generation. So you allow these commitments to naturally run their course and be implemented. And as the grid gets cleaner, of course, the electric vehicles that charge from the grid will be using that cleaner energy. I wouldn't necessarily advocate for building out infrastructure or solar or wind specifically to ensure that EVs charge using these cleaner fuels. I think, of course, the better approach is to allow the commitments to run their course, and the electricity grids within the region will naturally clean up. Now, if you're a private owner, or if you own a business and you're committed towards the environment and you want to mitigate the effects of climate change, then of course you could purchase an electric vehicle and charge that with solar on the roof of your business or your home. So those are commitments that you can make. But as it relates to the state, or governments, I think that they should just continue rolling out their commitments for RE, and that will have this natural synergy with the adoption of electric vehicles.
Excellent. The next question is about how can the power sector in the region prepare for its critical role in the new transportation ecosystem, particularly in the vehicles to grid interaction?
Yeah. So I would say that from most, in fact, I would say all the projects I'm involved in, the utility is always in the room as it relates to e-mobility. So they are one of the first stakeholders that is always present and consulted. And this goes for different member states. So member states always incorporate the electricity utility in any e-mobility project. So they are involved. To my knowledge, there was only one vehicle to grid pilot project, and that was implemented in Antigua and Barbuda, where they used, I think it was a Nissan Leaf, and a charger that was bidirectional to feed electricity from the batteries at the Nissan Leaf to power a building. So that is one example. But the regulations as it relates to vehicle to grid in the region is a barrier. A lot of the regulations that we inherited, there are some natural issues, of course. So in the electricity sector, for example, a lot of the legislation that we have is outdated because it looks at electricity being generated from a centralized source and being distributed. And we also have this challenge as well if you look at a vehicle to grid technology. So there would be quite a lot of work as it relates, starting at the legislative level to implement V2G in a large, as a larger project.
And in this, what role does digitalization play in electric mobility, and how can be incorporated into transportation in the Caribbean?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, what role does
digitalization play in electric mobility, and how can be incorporated into the transport sector?
Sorry, you broke up. What role does
digitalization plays in electric mobility?
Internationalization?
Digitalization.
Okay, I'm still not hearing that word. Sorry. Could you just quickly type it in the
Yes, I'll do
sorry,
it.
my apologies, ladies and gentlemen.
No, it's very fun. Sometimes we have these communication issues. Here is the question.
Oh, digitization. Thank you. Sorry, my apologies. It is playing a big role, and I'm happy to say that. Quite a number of electric bus projects within the region they're not only involved in purchasing an electric bus, but they're going all the way, meaning that they want to move towards providing an app whereby you could get information on the status of the bus, when it will arrive, etc. So there are quite a number of projects within the region that are looking at electric buses, but they are also incorporating digitization. So I'm pleased to say that is something that is of interest. I'm aware of regional companies that actually specialize in digitization of transportation, mainly out of Barbados. I'm not saying that Barbados is the only source. I'm just saying that that is at least the companies I'm aware of. So it is playing a role, and I'm glad to see that as well, that it is playing a role, digitization.
Great. And I think we have time for a couple more questions. This question is about how might electric mobility contribute to maritime decarbonization, especially considering the forthcoming carbon reduction regulations established by the International Maritime Organization?
Yeah, excellent question. So I would say that in the Trinidadian context, we produce and export quite a lot of methanol and ammonia. It's not green methanol, it's not green ammonia yet, it's natural gas based. And there is quite a lot of interest from international companies to use the methanol, to a lesser extent the ammonia, for shipping fuel. And there's quite a lot of talk about investing in that in Trinidad, because as I said, that we are a producer of methanol and ammonia. I'm aware of at least one project in the region that is looking at electric boats, and this would be electric boats in Guyana specifically. So it is an area that can be improved, but at least we are getting some pilot projects off the ground. But I guess the big one would be the interest of using or using Trinidadian methanol for shipping, as a shipping fuel.
Excellent. Coris, where can people find updated information regarding the data on the public EV adoption in the region?
So that is one of the scarcest data you got to find. I struggle myself to find that data. But I would like to refer you, if you are interested in the transportation sector within the region, the CCRE, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, on their website, they publish report cards for each one of the member states at CARICOM. And in their report card, they not only capture energy, but they capture transportation as well. So they are an excellent source of data for individual member states. It's currently updated annually. So that's a nice starting point if you do want to capture that data. If you want to capture data as well, the national budget statements from member states is a good starting point. The central bank for each one of the member states would publish information related to taxation of vehicles, etc., and you could use that information for transportation data as well. So those are the sources of data I would recommend.
Excellent, Curtis. Well, I think we're on time. Thank you so much for today's presentation. I really look forward to have further discussions, interesting discussions like this one. And thank you to everyone who were listening to today's conversation and your questions during Cody's presentation. Thank you again, Curtis.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fernando.
Bye. Thank you.